Hey guys, welcome back to the Make Heaven Crowded podcast. We're a faith-based podcast. We talk all things life, faith, and Jesus. My name's Taylor, and I'm the host of this podcast. And the last couple weeks, I decided we're going to do something a little different, which we're taking 2 weeks to go over a little bit of the story of Samson. There's so much to learn throughout Samson's story in Judges 13 through, I think, 16. And so there's so much that we learned. Last week we did 13 through 14. I recommend that you guys go back and watch or listen to that episode because there was a lot that we talked about in Samson's story that I'm not going to be able to recap today. And then we're going to pick up from where we left off last week. And so we're going to be starting in Judges 15, and we're going to start in verse 1, and we're going to read the whole thing. And we'll kind of break down as we go, but we're going to start off in verse 1. Later on, during the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat as a gift and visited his wife. I want to go to my wife in her room, he said, but her father would not let him enter. I was sure that you hated her, her father said, so I gave her over to one of the men who accompanied you. Isn't her younger sister more beautiful than she is? Why not take her instead? Pause here. So Samson left in anger and just left his wife. We don't know how long it was between the time that he left and the time that she remarried and then all of that. We don't know the time frame, but he left in anger, came back, and now his wife is married to someone else who was a part of his wedding party. Her father is now trying to convince Samson to take her little sister. So there's a lot going on. This family's kind of, I don't know, this family's like, oh, you left. We're going to give her off to marriage to someone else. Oh, you're back? Okay, let me give you her sister. Little weird. But we're going to jump back into verse 3. So Samson said to them, this time I will be blameless, and I will be blameless when I harm the Philistines. So he went out and caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a porch between each pair of tails. Then he ignited the torches and released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned the piles of grain and the standing grain as well, the vineyard and the olive groves. Then the Philistines asked, who did this? They were told it was Samson the Timnite's son-in-law, because he took Samson's wife and he gave her to his companion. So the Philistines went to her and her father and burned them to death. Wow. Hold on. Before we continue, Samson, in anger, left and went back home with his family. Now Samson comes back, and his wife is now married to one of his companions. And in anger, he caught 300 foxes, tied their tails together, lit them on fire, and let them loose between the olive groves, the vineyards, and all of their grain. Like, Samson was like, okay, take my wife. I'm going to burn down everything for the Philistines. And then we see the Philistines were angry, and they came back, and they killed Samson's wife and her family. Picking up in verse 7. Then Samson told them, because you have done this, I swear that I will not rest until I've taken vengeance on you. He tore them limb from limb and went down and stayed in the cave of the rock of Edom. The Philistines went up, camped in Judah, and raided Lehi. So the men of Judah said, why have you attacked us? They replied, we have come to tie Samson up and pay him back for what he did to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went to the cave at the rock of Edom and asked Samson, don't you realize that the Philistines rule us? What have you done to us? I've done to them what they have done to me, he answered. Pause there for a minute. So not only did Samson do these things out of anger, but now he's justifying his actions because he's like, well, I did what they did to me, so it's right. What I did was right because what I did is justified because of what they did to me. Guys, we can't justify what we do based off of how other people treat us. Because quite frankly, you don't know what's going on in someone else's life, and they may be treating you poorly, but you don't know what's going on in their life. And we see here that Samson is justifying what he did to the Philistines because of how they treated him. So it goes against what God tells us to do in Matthew when he talks about treating others the way you would like to be treated. And as Christians, we should be living that out. We shouldn't be like Samson of, well, what they did to me, I'm going to do what they did to me because it's justified. But in all reality, it's not justified. And what you're doing is wrong because you should be treating others the way you would like to be treated. Because it doesn't matter how they treat you. You should still be loving and showing the love of God to them, regardless of if they make you upset or not. Just like Samson did in his anger, we can't allow ourselves to then in our anger sin. And this is what we see happening here with Samson. So we're going to jump back into verse 12, and it says this. Burnt flax and fell off, and he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand, took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey I've piled them in heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey I've killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone and named that place the Jawbone Hill. He became very thirsty and called out to the Lord, You have accomplished this great victory through your servant. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? So God split a hollow place in the ground at Lehi, and water came out of it. After Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. And this is why it named Hakorah Spring, which is in Lehi today. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. So a lot happened in the last 8 verses of this chapter, and Samson was taken by the Israelites to go meet the Philistines, and they came shouting, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson, and Samson was able to, because of the Lord's strength, to take out all 1,000 men. But we see that Samson's choice was to use a jawbone, which again was against his covenant because he was going near a dead animal and it was fresh. So he took the fresh jawbone of a donkey to kill 1,000 men. And we see here in verse 16 with what Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have piled them in heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men. Right here, Samson is like living out in his ego. Because Samson had the opportunity to give the glory to the Lord, but right here, Samson's like, I did this. I killed 1,000 Philistines. I piled them up in heaps. This was me. And then a couple verses later, he became thirsty, and then he calls out to the Lord. This is the first time in all of Samson's story so far that we see him actually calling out to the Lord. Now, it's not to say that he didn't do it in other times, but this is the first time that we see it. And what he says is, You have accomplished this great victory through your servant. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? So Samson, not only he right then had his pride, but then he came to the Lord and he's like, okay, you did this through me. And then he's like, but now are you going to just let me die? Like, in the hands of the Philistines? Like, Samson was through this, we see his ego. And so before we get into chapter 16, this is the last chapter of Samson's story. A lot has happened so far. We see Samson constantly breaking his vow to the Lord between going to vineyards and constantly being involved with the Philistines, allowing his anger to dictate what he does, and breaking his vow by being around dead things. I think that's an important thing to recognize here, that it wasn't just this big compromise of Samson being with Delilah. It was Samson constantly making compromises in his walk with the Lord. He had this vow, but instead he was constantly compromising it for what he felt like he wanted to do in that moment. When he saw the girl from Timnah, he said, she is right in my eyes. And his parents are like, can't you find someone from among our people? And Samson's like, nope, she looks right to me. Samson was constantly compromising the things of the Lord for how he wanted to live, for the things he thought were right. And so we're going to see how this next compromise, where it leads him. And I plan on reading the whole chapter of 6. We're just going to jump in to verse 1 and we'll break it down as we go. And it says this, Judges 16 verse 1. Samson went to Gaza where he saw a prostitute and went to bed with her. When the Gazites heard that Samson was there, they surrounded the place and waited in ambush for him. All that night at the city gate. They kept quiet all night, saying, let's wait until dawn, then we will kill him. But Samson stayed in bed only until midnight. Then he got up and took a hold of the doors of the city gate, along with the 2 gate posts, and pulled them out, bar and all. He put them on his shoulders and took them to the top of the mountain and overlooked Hebron. So there's a lot that just happened in the first, 3 verses. Not only was Samson again compromising by sleeping with a prostitute that he found in Gaza, but then we see Samson only stayed until midnight. Then he took a hold of the doors of the city gate with its 2 gateposts, mind you, and he put them on his shoulder and just took them with him to overlook Hebron on the mountain. Samson literally just grabbed the city gate and just kept walking with the bars. There is no way that he would have this strength without the Lord. But we're going to jump back into verse 4. Sometime later, he fell in love with a woman named Delilah, who lived in the Sekron Valley, and the Philistines' leader went to her and said, "Persuade him to tell you where his great strength comes from, so we can overpower him, tie him up, and make him helpless. Each one of us will give you 1,000 or 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me, where does your strength come from, and how could someone tie you up and make you helpless?" And Samson told her, "If they tie me up with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not yet been dried, I will become weak and be like any other man." The Philistine leaders brought 7 fresh bowstrings that had not yet been dried, and she tied him up with them. While the men in ambush were waiting in her room, she called out to him, "Samson, the Philistines are here." But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of yarn snaps when he touched the fire, and the secret of his strength remained yet unknown. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me and told me lies. Won't you please tell me how you can be tied up?" And he told her, "If they tie me up with ropes that have never been used, I will become weak and like any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him up with them and shouted, "Samson, the Philistines are here." But when the men in ambush were waiting in her room, he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have mocked me all along and told me all lies. Tell me how you can be tied up." So before we keep going, something I want to point out here is Samson was in a bad relationship, right? But Samson was he had the opportunity to leave. I think sometimes we keep our self in places longer than we were meant to be there because, Samson wasn't supposed to even be there in the first place. And Samson kept keeping himself in this place because he fell in love with Delilah. She was not the right girl, yet he found himself in love with her, and she keeps coming to him and being like, "How can I take your strength from you? How can we tie you up?" And Samson comes up with some of the craziest excuses, right off the top of his head. To me, I would have been I don't know. But Samson was like, no, 7 fresh bowstrings or with new rope. Samson was constantly coming up with these new ideas. And we're going to see a couple more here as we read. And then we see Delilah does it. Not only did he tell her the things that would get rid of his strength, but she then did the very thing that he told her. And then was like, "The Philistines are here." And Samson was able just to break free. And then we see her being the victim, pretending to be the victim, at least, because she's like, "Samson, you lied to me. You don't love me because you're not telling me the truth." And yeah. Verse 13 again, towards the end of 13. He told her, "If you weave the 7 braids on my head into fabric on a loom." She fastened the braids with a pin and called out to him, "Samson, the Philistines are here." And he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the pin and the loom and the web. "How can you say I love you," she told him, "when your heart is not with me? This is the 3rd time that you have mocked me and not told me what makes your strength so great." But she nagged him day after day, pleading with him until she wore him out. And he told her the whole truth, said to her, "My hair has never been cut because I am a Nazarite to God from birth. If I am shaved, my strength will leave me and I will become weak like any other man." When Delilah realized that he had told her the whole truth, she sent out messages to the Philistine leaders, "Come one more time, for he has told me the whole truth." Then the Philistine leaders came out and brought the silver with them. Then she let him fall asleep on her lap and called a man to shave off the 7 braids of his head. And in this way she made him helpless, and his strength left him. Then she cried, "Samson, the Philistines are here." And when he awoke from his sleep, he said, I will escape as I did before, and I will shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. So not only was Samson constantly in this cycle of compromise, but he was also flirting with boundaries. Because Samson, he could have left that first time. The first time when she is like, "What would help me get rid of your strength?" And she does it. But Samson then stayed and let it happen 3 more times. And then she kept playing the victim card of "Well, you don't love me. You really don't love me." And all of these things, and nagging him day after day. But the difference that I see here compared to some of the other people in the Bible, like Joseph, for instance, when Potiphar's wife was nagging at him day after day, Joseph fled. She had the opportunity. She grabbed his coat and Joseph ran. But when Samson had the opportunity to run, he sat down and he told her the truth of the real reason that his strength would leave him. And he continued to flirt with the boundaries. which then she shaved his head and he got caught by the Philistines, and he did not realize that the Lord had left him. He was constantly trading what would feel good in a moment for what would make a lasting impact. The minute we see that he went into Gaza and he found a prostitute and he went and he slept with her. And then he tore down the city gates by the strength of the Lord. But then we see him meet Delilah, and he is in love with her. And he is allowing her she manipulates him into giving her the secret of what takes away Samson's strength. And so now we see that Samson is now seized by the Philistines, and we're going to jump back into verse 21. And it says this: the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he was forced to grind grain in the prison, but his hair began to grow back after it had been shaved. Now the Philistine leaders gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon, and they rejoiced and said, "Our God has handed over our enemy Samson to us." When the people saw him, they praised their God and said, "Our God has handed over to us the enemy who destroyed our land and who multiplied our dead." When they were in good spirits, they said, "Bring Samson in here to entertain us." So they brought Samson from the prison, and he entertained them. They had him stand between pillars. Pause here for a second. So not only was Samson now in prison, but they were using him for entertainment. And they were all rejoicing over the fact that they had caught Samson, because Samson had caused a lot of trouble for the Philistines, right? By killing people, he had caused a lot of trouble for the Philistines, as we've read, between the donkey bone and the angry wedding party thing, and he had just caused a lot of trouble for the Philistines. And so we see that they are ecstatic that Samson has now been caught. And then we see this. It says this in verse 26. Samson said to the young man who was leading him by the hand, "Lead me where I can feel the pillars supporting the temple so that I can lean against them." And the temple was full of men and women. All leaders of the Philistines were there. And they were about 3,000 men and women who were on the roof watching Samson entertain them. He called out to the Lord, "Lord God, please remember me. Strengthen me, God, just once more. And with an act of vengeance, let me pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson took a hold of the 2 middle pillars supporting the temple and leaned against them, one in his right and one in his left. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the leaders and all the people in there. And those he killed at his death were more than those he had killed in his life. Then his brothers and father's whole family came down and carried him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in a tomb of his father Manoah. So he judged Israel 20 years. Samson's story has so much that you can learn from it. Between constantly giving up, constantly compromising for what feels good in that moment versus what will make a lasting impact. Samson was constantly doing that, between being with the wrong girls to breaking the vow that he made to the Lord instead of being faithful and serving God the way that he was called to serve. Samson was called to be set apart, but he was constantly finding himself in places that were not meant for him. And I think we do the same as Christians. We are supposed to be set apart, yet we keep finding ourselves in places that we were never meant to be in. And just like Samson, I think we allow ourselves to continue on in that place longer than we were ever meant to be there. Because Samson could have left Delilah the first time it happened, but Samson sat around for it to happen a 4th time, which ultimately led to him ending up being in prison. And obviously the Lord used that. But Samson ended up being in prison because he was constantly willing to compromise. And so I think if we can learn anything from the last 2 chapters of Samson is, number 1, don't compromise for what feels good in that moment. Because if you are going to compromise for what feels good in that moment, you're going to be constantly compromising, because we have to deny ourselves. Matthew talks about denying ourselves and picking up our cross and following Jesus. It's not just I'm going to deny myself in this one moment. It's a constant battle. It's, you know what? I feel like I need this in this moment, but you know what? I know that's not true. And so I'm going to deny that, and I'm going to pursue Christ. When he went into the prostitute, Samson could have said, you know what? No, I don't need this. I'm going to be faithful to what God has called me to. But instead, what felt good in the moment was going into that prostitute. And so don't compromise what God is calling you to because you want to do what feels good in the moment. Now, God works all things together for the good, right? But God works all things together according to his will and for the good of those who love him. So we see here with Samson's story that God worked it together for good in the end. God ultimately a lot of trouble to the Philistines through Samson. I think another thing that we can learn from Samson's story is that don't sit around longer than you need to be somewhere. Because I think sometimes as Christians, we put ourselves, because of our sin, we put ourselves in a place that we were never supposed to be in, yet we continue to sit in it over and over again, falling back into the same temptation over and over again. Guys, do not sit in the same temptation. That is exactly what Samson did with Delilah. So my question is for you today, what are you sitting in that God is calling you out of? Because Samson was not meant to be sitting there with Delilah and allowing her to manipulate him constantly. Yet Samson stayed there. And so Samson brings down the temple on everyone who is inside by the strength and power of the Lord. And we see that Samson finally calls out to the Lord again. And so Samson ultimately, at the end of his life, when he called out to the Lord, he finally lived out his calling. But it took a long time because, he was constantly giving in to his temptations and to the things that he was not supposed to be a part of. And if we're being real honest, I think we do the same thing every day in our everyday culture. I know I do. Like, I struggle with this. I give into momentary temptation so that I can feel momentary whatever. I don't know, momentary relief or joy or whatever it is. I give into it momentarily and not realizing the lasting impact that temptation or sin makes. And I think we do this a lot as Christians. I think we constantly are giving in to momentary sin but we don't realize the lasting impact it can make. And so I pray that if you learned anything from the story of Samson, I pray that it's don't walk away from your calling from the Lord to fulfill momentary temptations. And lastly, I pray that you would call out to the Lord, and because the Lord is good. The Lord gave Samson the strength to tear down the temple. God is good. He is faithful and he's just. I thank you guys so much for joining me on the last 2 episodes about the story of Samson, but I hope to see you guys on the next week's episode.